Well, good evening. Thank you all for being here tonight. I'm Randy Wyckoff, the Dean of the College of Public Health, and it's a pleasure to welcome you all to the Leading Voices in Public Health lecture for November. Tonight's topic is one of tremendous interest to folks in higher education. The MOOC, the Massive Open Online Course, is something that a lot of folks are talking about, and I'm really honored and pleased to see my colleagues, fellow deans, and faculty from many different colleges across the university here tonight. As most of you know, the MOOC has been touted as eventually being the end of the bricks and mortar university, all the way to being a passing fad. And the truth is, it's probably somewhere on that spectrum. And there's nobody who is better qualified to talk about it than our speaker this evening. Dr. Ian Lapp is the Associate Dean for Strategic Educational Initiatives at the Harvard School for Public Health. As many of you know, Harvard recently started edX, and the School of Public Health is one of the first two schools there to be providing an edX course. So this is really the cutting edge of where the MOOC is today. Dr. Lapp is a PhD from Syracuse in sociology. Prior to going to Harvard, he was the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and Education at Columbia. And importantly for us, he's a member of the Council on Education for Public Health, which is our accreditation body. So really one of the most nationally respected thinkers about public health education in general and the MOOC in specific. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Ian Lapp.
Thank you, Andy. Very kind of you. I could not be more delighted to be here. This, as Dean Wyckoff didn't mention, is actually my second time back to ETSU in less than a year. And if you've ever experienced when you go somewhere, you're kind of in a daze, everything looks new to you. But the second time back, it's really allowed me to absorb so much of your great university. And it's made me further appreciate what a great College of Public Health you have. As you know, Dean Wyckoff has been seminal in the field in terms of the national discussions around undergraduate public health, leading the Critical Components Initiative, which established standards for a core curriculum and a curriculum in general in undergraduate public health. Your Associate Dean, Dr. Rob Pack, has really been a really powerful voice for change, both at the undergraduate public health level, but also at the graduate level. And we're often co-conspirators on thinking about what is and saying, why not? And so really it's an honor to be here and also to have spent so much time with students today. It's really, really been a pleasure. So I want to share with you our story, our adventures in this arena, but really to, most importantly, engage all of us in a conversation about what we see as the future of education in public health, education in the health professions, education in general. And I think that Dean Wyckoff framed it quite well. There's a lot of talk about it, and it is probably somewhere in between. Your great university just came off of celebrating its centennial, and my School of Public Health gets ready to celebrate its centennial in the fall of 2013. And I thought I would, perhaps going a little old school, I know we're here to talk about technology, take us back to the beginning of the 20th century and the discussions about the formation of what would someday become the Harvard School of Public Health. And as our Dean Julio Frank and I like to talk about this, well, everyone's been talking since April about how Harvard and MIT collaborated. We say that's just new news. We go back with MIT back to our very beginning. And that is the formation of the Harvard-MIT School for Public Health Officers, which by all accounts is the first formal academic education program in public health in North America. So the founding director of the Harvard-MIT School for Public Health Officers, Milton Rosenau, wrote in JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, about his vision, the founding faculty's vision for what a school of public health could be. What he argues here is this idea here for a separate faculty, which now is standard in accreditation criteria, but then what was very much a fledgling field was a radical idea back then. But as you see here from the quote, it also spoke very much vividly that public health is inherently interdisciplinary. And for it to succeed, it must engage the entire university. But as you also see, from those early on roots of our school up in Boston, this idea here that a school of public health must go beyond the university. It must engage the community. It must engage the globe. Think about Milton Rosenau's comments about 1915 and where the world was in terms of communication and travel. And then jump ahead to where we are now. Let me give you one other thought coming from a former dean at the Harvard School of Public Health and now the president of the IOM, Harvey Feinberg. Feinberg and colleagues talked about in 1994 in what is really a seminal piece that traces the history of public health education and projects into the future where we need to go. And I think Dr. Feinberg was quite visionary in predicting what we now face among the great schools of public health. Now more than ever, the challenges of public health are immense in magnitude. Now more than ever, as I talked with faculty and doctoral students earlier in the day, are the challenges not about vision, but how to implement the visions that we have for greatness in a school of public health. But as Feinberg notes back then, we need to look at the new and expanding opportunities. For all the challenges that public health has, educationally and in the field, there is an immense opportunity that's happening in the second decade of the 21st century. When the Harvard-MIT School for Public Health Officers was founded, in 1915, when the seminal Welch-Rose report was written, there was major dramatic changes in the ability to improve health taking place at the beginning of the 20th century. I think we face that similar situation at the beginning of the 21st century. But what we also are seeing for the first time, which makes it different 100 years later, is one of the most revolutionary times in education that we've seen. Some have said since Gutenberg and the press. What does this mean for higher education? What does this mean as schools of public health try to envision a new curriculum, while they also think about what the right platforms are for delivery? These are the things I want you to think about. This is the things that I want us to converse about. But before we jump into the technology, I want to talk a little bit about what it means to be a spectacular teacher. And you have them amongst your midst. You have the most downloaded iTunes professor in anatomy among your faculty. And you have many other great teachers among them. One of my favorite books out there, and well worth a read, is What the Best College Teachers Do. And what Bain points out in this comprehensive study, he traveled across the country to look at what great teachers do in various different disciplines, is make the point about what it means in terms of a quality of knowing. And points out, as I think we know, but it's worth emphasizing, that knowing one's discipline, being expert, matter of fact, being a great scholar is not good enough for being a great educator. emphasizing this idea here that what he saw in common across the great educators at some of the research universities, liberal arts colleges, community colleges across this land was that the great teachers consistently had this ability, as noted here, to use their knowledge to develop techniques for grasping fundamental principles and organizing concepts that others can use to begin building their own understanding and abilities. Great ideas are only as great as their ability to be communicated. Great expertise are only as great as their ability to be transferred, to be passed on to the next generation of public health professionals, of physicians, of artists, of poets, of engineers. I start here with what the great teachers do, because no matter what the medium that we're here to talk about, without that magical ingredient of a great teacher, it doesn't matter whether it's online or in the classroom, in the field, or on campus. This doesn't happen without looking at great teachers, what they do, and what we also know, speaking of other revolutions, the revolution in cognitive science about how people learn. If anything, I'd make the argument that the medium I'm here to talk about tonight, in which many of you are also engaged in terms of online learning, has a great ability to amplify great teaching, but also an equally great ability to amplify bad teaching. I'd make the argument that great educators are looking for that entry point for learning. They're information providers, they're inspirations, they're obviously assessors. But I make the argument that to be successful in our classrooms here at ETSU or online, they have to be educational planners, educational designers. What the great teachers do is they measure learning by what students do. They engage students in activities that will produce that desired outcome. Remember, folks, this is about learning in the end. What I'd like to argue, though, is that what is happening in this latest revolution in technology is that we have a platform that does focus more and more on what the students are doing. And we'll talk about and debate this. I want to share with you the work of our dean, Julio Frank, who spoke in this illustrious series back in February about his interprofessional treatise in The Lancet that he did with Lincoln Chen. Because this also fits into the context of the conversation around MOOCs. What Frank and Chen argue for is this idea here of interdependent world. And I think what I'm here to talk about very much embodies what you see there. This idea here of global learning. Can we create communities leveraging the technologies that we have? Out of the report, our own school is engaged in a look at both our professional and research degrees, both at the master's and doctoral level. And as part of the guiding principles, I wanted to share with you 3 of them, of the 7. This idea here of modular and flexible approaches to the educational experience. As an example, and many of you are probably familiar with this concept of word clouds, we did a word cloud of this request for applications at the university for some startup money. And what was striking is in the word cloud, the biggest word in the word cloud at Harvard was courses. I like the argument that in 5 years, I think that word will be smaller. maybe a little harder to read. I think what's happening right now is we're starting to think about public health learners in general, not in these start in week 1 and go for 14 weeks or 8 weeks, whatever the semester or quarter system may be. That learning only happens on campus at certain times. So we're making the argument as we envision our second century in education at the Harvard School of Public Health, informed by the principles of modular and flexible. And this idea here that we match the educational goals to the best delivery system that we think is effective. And that if someone can learn something and we can assess that learning completely online, then that's where we should be doing it. And there are certain things that are best done using certain pedagogies in the classroom. That's where we need to bring the students for that. Certain things are in the field, etc. Match the goals to the medium and master that medium for the best learning possible. And then, of course, what we're here to talk about tonight. To not give a blind eye to the technological revolution that is making an indelible mark on the state of modern-day higher education. So this all began last spring when Harvard and MIT joined forces to create edX, then later on joined by the University of California, Berkeley, and then most recently in the last month by the University of Texas system. The courses are online. You can register tonight. They cost you nothing other than your brain power and time, which is probably more valuable. And this is the collaboration. You're probably also familiar with a few other entities, probably the most famous of them all and largest of them all, Coursera, which has, I think, 30-plus universities involved, and at least 5 or 6 of our peer institutions that Harvard and ETSU have. But as you see here, other than MIT, we have schools of public health at all 3 institutions that are in there. And so here's the numbers as I speak to you tonight. More than 50,000 students in our public health course, which teaches epidemiology and biostatistics. It is the full, complete course, the course that we teach on campus, being delivered. It began on October 15th. It wraps up in the middle of January. And like many, and this is where the MOOCs began, we have our own computer science course for a grand total of roughly over 150,000 students. Just to put it in context for those who are not fully familiar with schools of public health, there are now 50 accredited schools of public health, 48 of them in the United States, 1 in Mexico, 1 in Canada. They enroll a total of 26,000 students. Of those 26,000, 13,000 of them are MPH students. So we have a scale issue here. And while both of these faculty that are teaching are highly accomplished educators and have been on the faculty in both cases for somewhere between 20 and 30 years, they've now been teaching for the last few weeks more students than they've educated in their entire career. And as you see here, and it might surprise you, 1/3 of the learners are in the United States, followed by India, and then we jump down to smaller numbers out of the UK. We're very happy that we're making our reach into parts of Africa, as well as you see, we have Spain as well. And then, I don't know what the full country count is, but it's an extraordinary number of countries when you spread it out. So here, I'd like to just walk you through some of the merits of what we believe 21st century learning could perhaps look like. If you come back to this idea here of educational planners, we'd make the argument that this platform really is in many ways student-centered. How many people have tried one of these online courses via Coursera or edX? Okay, so a few of them. Okay. So for the majority who aren't familiar with it, the basic concept, and in edX talk we call it, it's called chunk and test. It doesn't sound very appealing. But this idea here that these are lectures in miniature, anywhere from 5-6 minutes to close to 10 minutes, teaching a concept, and then the students are tested on it. And this works its way through, and there are assignments, there are due dates for the assignments, and there are penalties if you don't complete the assignments in a timely manner. And by the middle of January, one could successfully complete what is 2 of the core requirements in public health, epidemiology and biostatistics. The grading is automated, so when you're doing multiple choice, you get immediate feedback, why this answer was correct, and equally important, why the answer was incorrect. So assessment is built in rather intimately into the learning process, much more so than a traditional lecture-style course in any subject matter. There are TAs. We have a great TA ratio of 4 TAs for 50,000 students. We pay them the same amount as we do the on-campus TAs. We got a real good bargain. But the way it works here is that for those who are familiar more with the Facebook arena or anything else, people ask questions, and as people ask similar questions, the most common questions rise to the top, and less common questions fall to the bottom. And so teaching assistants or the faculty are responding to the format. Again, no obligation, but give it a try. Go home tonight or sometime this week to our platform or one of the other platforms, and it's really, you can feel like an anthropologist in a whole new world playing things out. We'd also make the argument, and again, as you're seeing here, we're informed by the literature, that again, if assessment drives the learning process, again, a fundamental tenet, I would argue, and one that I've preached for a long time for traditional classroom-based teaching, is that assessment drives the learning process. Online learning helps support learning quite effectively because of that immediate feedback, because of the assessment, and that you design the assessment with the competencies in mind. So that the workshop we did earlier today as a faculty in the College of Public Health, much of what we talked about in classroom learning applies in this environment as well. And the fact that we can be much more competency-based and we can assess immediately whether someone has attained a competency is quite important. Again, this is just one study. I think there's more work to be done, but it makes the argument from, again, a very carefully peer-reviewed article that in the case of statistics, they found it was a much more nimble and effective environment. So we're left with this question, is this indeed a disruptive innovation? What does this mean? Is it a substitute or a supplement? And please start registering those questions in your mind because we're coming to the dialogue part. Even though I do feel like this is a little distance ed, all the A students are in the back rows, of course. I might have to come down off the podium in a few minutes. Start thinking about your questions because this is really meant first and foremost as a conversation. So here's just taking a step back. We started at the beginning of the 20th century, but I'll just take the more modern era here of the timeline. This began, in many ways, crediting MIT, which began the open courseware movement. This idea here that they provided open access to basically the majority of their courses that are taught at MIT, the syllabi and the course material, open to the world. This then later evolved here, and again in very short order, beginning with a computer science course at Stanford, and then splitting out as you see. And then as outlined here in this graphic from this article, 4 Barriers that MOOCs Must Overcome, how do you monetize this? What is the future and role of credentials in terms of these ideas here of badges? The course completion rate. I can't report to you because our course isn't over yet, but if our course plays out like many of the courses on the other platforms, we'll have roughly a 10% completion rate. Again, still an extraordinary number of students, from 50,000 down to 5,000. But if that happens, that's roughly what will play out. It's often referred to as sort of an inverted pyramid, where the course starts in week 1 with the full large-scale enrollment, and week by week the numbers trail off. Some would make the argument that, while that seems a little much a problem, that any opportunity, even if it's for a few sessions, is a win in terms of a learning opportunity, a win in terms of democratizing education. As well as you're wondering, and we've been debating this a lot, Dean Wyckoff and I, is how do we know that the person on the other end is actually the person taking the test? And what does that mean for certificates and badges? Now, obviously, many of you have grappled with that in the online education that you offer already here. But when we're dealing with these large numbers, where you have lots of opportunities for people to both be quite legitimate about the experience, or you be amazed, actually, as I'm understanding, in the larger, I'm not talking about our course in particular, but in the larger era of MOOCs, when you read the literature, that there's no grades, there's no payment, but there still seems this great desire to figure out a way to beat the system. So one of the common techniques, don't try this at home, is register under 2 different email addresses so you get your answers off of one, and then you can switch identities and get the answers. So a demonstration that honor codes perhaps go out the window when it comes to the online environment. But many of these issues, if we find that this medium is effective in the end, if we're talking about learning, can be addressed. And many of the platforms are starting to think in particular around student authentication. And I think one of the biggest lingering questions out there is, how do you monetize this, or can you monetize it? So in summary, and these are just some of the strengths, and I don't want to downplay, I know I'm using very numeric terms that we don't think about learning volume, but I do like the word reach. And I have to say I'm not a full fan of the MOOC acronym, but I'll speak more to the roots of the schools of public health. I haven't come up with the right acronym, but I know that Dean Wyckoff is the expert at acronyms, so you have a task for this at hand. But in many ways, this is population-based education. PBE doesn't ring any better, so I'm not going to claim any victory today. But I bet you by the time we're done tonight, Professor Wyckoff will have an answer. And you see here these areas. edX is going to be an open source architecture, so people can add stuff, and it plays out. edX is a nonprofit venue. The investment of capital has primarily come from Harvard and MIT at a significant investment, over $60 million. Some of the weaknesses, we've talked about them, and they play out. I should note, and actually as I look at that list, one of the other strengths, and I was remiss in mentioning it, part of the intent of doing edX for both Harvard and MIT, and they've said this all along, is the commitment to improving on-campus learning. So we're collecting data on students' reception on certain video. We're tracking what questions are right questions and wrong questions for informing the type of testing that we do in our traditional formats. This is looked at as in many ways an opportunity to better understand how people learn and to cycle back that to improve both this medium but also the on-campus medium. And speaking of on-campus, so we're in a position now where we have, by the end of January, created an online version of biostatistics and epidemiology. And at least in our initial thinking, we're considering putting the entire core curriculum online via the MOOCs, which would involve environmental health science, the social behavioral sciences, as well as health service administration. There are 5 core areas, but our current course integrates biostatistics and epidemiology, which in some ways is an innovation in itself. For those physicians in the room, we're also, the medical school, very likely in the near term at Harvard, be offering a clinical trials design and methods course. That's through Harvard Catalyst, which is, for those who are familiar, the CTSA's initiative that plays out. So what does all this mean for what we do on campus? We've already been engaged in a lot of discussions of what it means when you have so many undergraduates doing public health and what it means for the MPH. But what does this mean when students, through this platform or other platforms, can take the core curriculum? Do we start accepting the badges and certificates from our platform or other platforms at ETSU or at Harvard? What does this mean? Does this mean for my school that perhaps before you start classes, you do these online formats and we do stuff on campus, more case-based learning, because we've shifted online the knowledge transfer involved with these foundational areas, and we do application both in the classroom and in the field? These are some of the possibilities where you create synergies between this medium and the medium on campus, and some of the things that we're considering. What does this mean for the public health workforce, which currently is much more of a bricks and mortar format? What does it mean for faculty development, in particular across the world, where many of these places seek help from ETSU or my school to help start new schools of public health? And one of the greatest challenges in a lot of these resource-poor settings is faculty. Can this be a faculty development tool? Can this be a way of alleviating some of the burden for certain types of teaching? So as we go from an era where we're focusing on clicks more so than bricks, what does this mean for the full landscape of public health education, education in the health professions, education in general? And this whole idea of the flipped classroom, and some of you, maybe many of you, are familiar with the Khan Academy, which was in many ways first out of the block, where students in K through 12 in California are doing their math homework in school, and they're doing the math lessons at home. can we think about more public health education being in that format? Because if we come back to the ideas I laid out in the beginning of the talk about measuring learning by what the students do, does more active learning techniques in campus, is this facilitated by shifting certain things online? These are the things we need to think about. So in summary, these are some of the major elements that play out, and some of the things that we're grappling with. I welcome comments and questions from the audience. Thank you so much. I'm taking tweets.
Hello?
And other things. I'm just kidding.
You talked about supplement and substitute.
Yes.
So my question for you is whether you've actually partnered, say, with a small college somewhere, Nigeria or Appalachia, so that they would get the didactic foundation through your courses and do the hands-on dialogue type of thing. Right. Has that been done yet?
I'm not aware of it being done, using the MOOCs at least. Obviously there are examples of online programs that are doing that. But I think that's really part of the aspiration, I think the greatest potential. That we could do this, but for that matter, despite our institution's reputation, there are certain parts of education, public health, or in other areas that other places do better. So I really see the learning going in many different directions. What I think it also does, off of your point, is while some of the instruction that our institution or other institutions might provide serves as a supplement for others, I think it sets the platform up, which is where it really gets exciting, for collaboration. You know, for field-based experiences for our students in exchange for material that is in courses. What it also does, which I think is embedded in your question, is it does something for learning in general that higher education could benefit from, is a greater focus on education. Because the platform really starts to challenge folks to be really great at teaching, really great at promoting learning in a very public forum. And I think this will have so many ancillary benefits for what actually happens on campus. It'll have so many benefits for others to look and see, well, here's how a master teacher teaches this subject matter. So that I have to believe of those 50,000 students, there are many faculty at other places that are watching and learning. And in fairness, probably critiquing. There are probably some weeks where there's someone out there in the world that might even be able to teach that better. And I love the idea here that we are raising the bar on what it means to effectively teach. So I do think it'll be a supplement, and in some cases a substitute.
Ian, while I'm looking for other questions, a question for you and a comment. I think if we start thinking of the MOOC like a textbook,
right,
none of us would have any hesitation in having our students go home and read someone else's textbook. Yet we seem uncomfortable letting them go home and watch someone else's lecture that would essentially be summarized in a textbook. But that was an observation. The question is, the MOOC seems to be driving this concept of 6 to 10 minute mini talks. And yet that's not how most of us ever learned or taught. What's the science behind that? What's the rationale for that?
Great. So, Randy, I'm glad you asked that latter question. I want to come back to the first comment as well. This is what I mean about elevating the quality of teaching. We've known for a long time through the cognitive science literature that attention span tends to wane anywhere between 16 to 18 minutes in the delivery of any information in a single medium. And that you need something, and I apologize for the real cognitive scientists out there, I'm a sociologist by training, What I often talk to faculty about is how do you reset attention span and what you do in the classroom. What this format does is it lends itself out to how the brain functions in terms of learning. These short intervals and then test. And I think it's easily, and I think some of the best teachers replicate that. And go check it out in some of the classrooms here at ETSU tomorrow. The best folks will give mini lectures and then ask a question. The best teachers might lecture for 15 minutes and then do a group assignment in class for another 15. I often say that when someone has an hour, they should be breaking it up at least into thirds, if not quarters, with different delivery. And I think the MOOCs demonstrate the efficacy of that. The one thing, for us all to ruminate on, because I think your textbook metaphor is a very good one. And I won't ask the students in the classroom because ETSU students are the best of the best. But how many students always do the reading before they come to class? Are people going to go and watch the lectures before they come to class? And I am left to wonder on this. The flipped classroom, I think, works. But other elements for another discussion is how do you motivate learners? And this is dependent on people, again, watching material, and the material being compelling enough to actually watch.
You used the term evolved in very short order when you talked about the MIT. To me, It seems like all of this is going to evolve in very short order, and that students very quickly are going to be looking, as they already are, for, quote, certification, credit, or whatever. And we've got a model in which a 10% completion rate is not dismal, but is spectacular or disruptive, whatever you want to say. Right. We're soon going to have not tens of thousands, but hundreds of thousands of students who are going to have certificates or badges, or they're going to be very quickly going to be a way to get credit for this, and they're going to be showing up right here in Johnson City, Tennessee. So what is your thinking about how quickly this is likely to evolve, and how short order is that going to be?
Well, I can't fully predict the future, but I think what this does is it challenges all of us on campus to do better at educating. I think it challenges all of us to, coming back to the earlier comments, to think differently about how we deliver education. I think one of the challenges in public health education for a long time is we delivered the core curriculum in a one-size-fits-all model. You could be a medical student or a physician who's already had a little bit of epidemiology and biostat, but you still need to sit through the same lectures with other people. You could have been phenomenal in math as an undergraduate, or for that matter in high school, but you're still sitting through with some options to test out. And I think that's been the great frustration. So that what this format lends itself to is a lot more self-directed learning, but also really challenges schools of public health, schools in general, to really ramp up assessment. And that's where we really, in the end, are far behind. When you talk about short order, I think you captured it right. But schools of public health, professional education in general, really lags behind in terms of assessment. And I think what we need to ramp up is how we assess learning so that we can actually grapple with the growing heterogeneity of what will likely start arriving in Johnson City or in Boston or in New York or in San Francisco, or for that matter in Paris or Botswana. The other element I think that emerges out of your question is how we think our goals are for what students are to achieve during our degree programs. And what this sets us up to do is try to think much more about learning as lifelong, because it's what they do for us, but trying to create an ongoing relationship with our students beyond. And I think that's the other area that excites me. I too don't have the answers and I worry, but I remain excited by the possibilities of how we can much more sustain learning beyond the walls of our classrooms, beyond the gates of our campus.
I was curious as to what the demographics are for some of the courses that you were showing earlier. Are these younger students and they're coming out of high school, or are they adult students that this is their second time around? Because I'm having a hard time seeing people that have a hard time getting up in the morning to show up for class, having the discipline to do something like that.
Right. The short answer is I don't know. And actually I don't know the definitive answer, so I know that we collect regional demographics. I don't know actually, I apologize, if we're collecting age demographics, prior education, or anything else. It's a good question. I'll have to get back to you on that, but you are speaking to the issue here of who are these learners. And I think this is one of those key questions. What we are seeing, from the numbers is this is clearly giving access to education to a number of folks who in the past haven't had it. But are these certain type of learners that lend themselves to this environment? Again, you're emphasizing what I share a concern on. Part of successful learning is motivating learners. And it does take a very disciplined learner to work through this format. Yet to be seen. I apologize, I don't have the answer for you.
Is it all altruism? What's the benefit to Harvard?
Right.
What's the business plan? Excuse me, the business plan. You get better students, you get more influence countrywide, but somebody sat in a room somewhere and said, how are we going to benefit and justify the resources?
I think, at least for Harvard and MIT, and I'm not speaking formally on behalf of edX, there are people who are more expert on it. It is designed as a nonprofit. Some of the other platforms are funded with venture capital, and I think they make the argument that they are in a nonprofit sense. But at some point, all these places are going to have to monetize. Because it's a significant investment on the part of, in this case, our institutions. But as we know, and if you talk to the best teachers here at ETSU, great teaching may look easy, but like so many other things, it's because people put a lot of time in. And for all of its promise, it is a tremendous amount of work to do something like this. And that's really one of the big questions on that screen where I showed the 4 issues. How do we actually figure out what the economic model is? The intent is to start charging at some point, not in this current cycle, for these badges and certificates. That is the intent of edX and Coursera, so that they can recoup some costs in the process. But it is a challenge, and Dr. Pack and I have talked a lot about this. A lot of content on the internet, the expectation is free. And the closest example I can think of is some of the major newspapers that are closing up shop have finally started to charge for their online content, for example, like the New York Times. They've been able to succeed in that model. But the question for many other newspapers is they're still not succeeding in that. When this goes from free to X dollars, I think the talk, and I'm not speaking in any official terms, are anywhere between $50 to $100 for a certificate. Some have talked about even less. A lot of it is conjecture, and again, I'm not making an official statement. This is the big question. If you ask MIT, at least when you read the articles, why they went to OpenCourseWare, again, it was part of a fundamental belief of open access, democratizing education. I think that's the spirit of edX, and I think it'll remain that. But it is an expensive endeavor, and when you look at the .com rise up at the end of the 1990s and early 2000s, There was a similar investment by a number of universities to ride that wave, and universities lost tens of millions of dollars. Yet to be determined what happens in the next few years.
As you all look forward with the programming, what's the implications for overcoming language barriers and internationalization in these other countries? It looked to me like mostly we're obviously English speaking at the moment.
Right. I don't know what the official process is, but you point out quite astutely that while our numbers are significant, there are billions of folks who this would not be accessible if they don't speak English. And I think that's one of the next challenges. And I'm excited by the possibility of Spanish or Chinese playing out, but I don't know officially whether that's the direction that plays out with this. But again, this speaks to the opportunity, and I think as the platform is open source, what do other great universities around the world do to contribute to this model? And so that this becomes really that global classroom that we've all more metaphorically spoken to. It's a real good question.
You had on your PowerPoint slide that talked about advantages of MOOCs. One of them was low capital investment.
Right.
I was going to say, let's talk a little more about that, but you have talked a little more about that.
Right.
I would think that these are actually highly produced learning environments, and that there's actually a fairly sizable investment
Right.
in creating a MOOC as compared to just a general online course, because they're really high tech, really low touch.
Right.
Could you speak at all to the development costs for the courses that you're looking at?
Yeah. I can't speak to the exact dollars that we've spent. What's meant by that argument, and I should note, actually, I was remiss, David Hunter, who was the original speaker, sends his regrets and regards that he couldn't be here. And so these slides are actually a collaboration of both of ours. What's meant by that is in a scale version, low capital investment, to reach as many students as we are reaching. And you pointing out, thank you, that we had to actually fix that. Obviously, the investment that Harvard's put in general, as well as what our school has been quite significant. And again, speaks to the privileged position that Harvard and MIT are in higher education. But as the platform goes open source, as like everything we've seen in technology, the prices continue to drop down. It does become, in terms of an issue of reach, from a technology perspective, lower capital investment. As we've all seen in the online environment. When the beginning of 2000, many of the platforms that we now use quite commonly to do the online learning you do here at ETSU used to cost $10,000 or $20,000 a year for a subscription. In many cases now it's anywhere between $600 to $800 to have access to 500 students 24/7. So that's really much more what we meant by that. I think the biggest thing is the faculty investment, and we haven't talked much about that tonight. What are the reward systems for faculty? What does this mean in terms of their own intellectual work? These are all the things that we have not fully come to grips with. So I'm glad you asked the question in a sense. There's clearly, for being an early adopter in this process, there's a huge capital investment. But in terms of the overall reach and what it's capable of, that's when we come up with that idea. I'm glad you asked to clarify it.
I think the idea of democratizing education is really interesting. I'd be curious to know if you've looked at the difference in completion rates between international students and US-based students, and also if you've looked at what the students' perceptions of the course completion is between US-based students, and especially students in developing countries that may not have access to library systems like we do here, may not be as accustomed to these types of free services.
I apologize, and I'm starting to say a lot of times I don't know, but they're collecting a lot of extensive data, and the course is still in progress, so we'll have a better idea come early winter. I'm glad to see President Nolan here. He already invited me back when the weather is nicer, so maybe I'll get that invite back on a beautiful spring day to give you that data. But all kidding aside, I think these are all the things that we really need to think about. It's one thing, as you said, to talk about democratizing learning. It's one thing to talk about how we recoup costs. But in the end, if this is, as I started the presentation, about learning, how do we know that we actually are not only crossing borders, but we're actually crossing borders in an effective learning manner? And the scale allows us to understand learning better, but it also gets us to understand the challenges of promoting learning in the format that we're speaking to. Again, I would really emphasize that if there's one of the greatest takeaways from this is that when it's done right and when it's done well, and I'm not making any claim that what we've done is perfect as a school of public health, it really challenges our ways of thinking about how we can really teach concepts, create situations of learning that last.
Ian, I'm interested in the accreditation perspective. Have you had any encounters with CEEF or North Central in relationship to accreditation? Or is that a privilege of Harvard, too?
So, again, I can't officially speak for the accrediting body that I sit on the board for, but this is carefully being watched. I feel like every other week there's a Chronicle Higher Ed article about this very particular issue. In its most positive sense, if indeed we are being effective in teaching competencies, if indeed our schools are better positioned to start assessing that, I don't see major accreditation issues. It does, again, which I think would have happened either way, and I'm just talking more specifically about public health education. We're doing a lot of measuring of time put in rather than always measuring the learning that comes out. And some of these are not about the accreditation bodies, but they are federal laws out of the Department of Education, which perhaps, and again, I'm not speaking officially on anyone's behalf, need to equally be revisited in an era where learning takes place in many places in many different formats. Look, this is an earth-shaking activity right now, and let's see how it all really settles out. But maybe to answer this question, do I see the campus-based university going anywhere? I don't. Do I hopefully see us doing even better work than we currently do on our campuses in terms of learning? I absolutely have to believe in that. But this won't replace it in the same way that the last decade of online learning hasn't put our places out of business. It just really changes the landscape of learning.
You had mentioned about some of the benefits of immediate feedback assessment utilizing multiple choice mechanisms.
Right.
And I know that you're in the early stages of implementing these programs, but is there any technological system in place for utilizing writing development and oral presentation skills with 4 TAs and 50,000 students?
Right. So the edX platform, at least from HarvardX, hasn't implemented what some of the other platforms have done, which is peer assessment of learning, because there are clearly some subject matters, including in public health, where multiple choice is not going to be effective a medium. And so it's, again, early stages on these platforms, but I'm very excited about this idea here of peer assessment. Because again, what it does is it drives back to what we've known for a long time about learning. And what the best teachers do at ETSU when it comes to learning assessment is they create rubrics. And when they do effective rubrics, it promotes learning while assessing learning as well. When the MOOC platform is successful in peer grading, it's contingent on the faculty member creating the ultimate rubric, because it's asking novice learners or intermediate learners to assess others. But I do believe that it is possible for it to play out, and we'll see what the early returns are. There is a pretty good literature before the era of MOOCs on the efficacy of well-designed peer assessment. It can be done more often very poorly, but when done right, it can be quite good.
From an assessment standpoint, is this a pass-fail model, or is there a hierarchy? Are people leaving with grades or numbers, or because we all know that's what motivates the students here, and I'm just wondering if this is just a completion certificate. Is that all that they leave with, or is there an honors certificate, et cetera?
I don't know actually all the answers to that question, but you do need to, it's not merely handing the homework in, you do have to get a certain level of passage week in and week out, as well as we're at the point in this current course where if you haven't handed in the homeworks, procrastination doesn't work well online as it doesn't work well in the classroom. So there's some folks in that inverted triangle that they've already put themselves in a position where they can't complete the course because they haven't timely and as well as effectively handed in their assignments. But there isn't any grading system per se in terms of even a high pass or a low pass method, and perhaps there will be. These are all, that's why I really meant it in a sense that I didn't come here to give you all the answers, but really to share with you our journey and really for us to think about what this all means. But what this also speaks to comes back to the earlier question on accreditation and testing. Again, we haven't fully formulated our thinking, but if we were to experiment with using our MOOC for students that were admitted to our school come this spring or next spring, and they had to do this before they came on campus, I think right now at least we'd probably still test them when they came on campus to make sure that they can do the biostatistics and epidemiology. Again, I can't officially say that's going to be the case, but I think that at least that's some of the initial thinking, that the immediate feedback and assessment is important for learning. But if you've done the thing and it's been a month or two or three, I think when you're on campus, we want to assess you again to make sure that you got it.
Along that same line, how about those dropouts? How often are you going to recycle the course?
Right.
Because production is going to be costly. And if you want to get your money's worth, it'd be important to recycle it and maybe get some of the dropouts back.
Well, that comes back to that low capital investment issue. At some point, the whole beauty, I guess, at least from a cost perspective, is you are, I wouldn't say in a one and done model here where you record it once, but we will most likely, and we'll see how it plays out, have to go back. And when we look at the data, say, you know what, we have to take certain questions out of the assessment because they're not the most effective questions. Or when we're looking and testing the students, we realize, you know what, Professor X in that module could have done a more effective job of teaching the concept, and we'll have to re-record. But the aspiration, a focus on aspiration, is that you create at some point, and for certain subject matters it lends itself, a course that at least could cycle for 3 or 4 years without having to be updated. So that's really kind of the intent here. What's different, just to be clear for those who aren't familiar with the format, using the Khan Academy as an example, any of us can go home this evening and pick any module you'd like. These courses both in Coursera as well as ours, you register for them. They have a start time and an end time. So come February, you can't give the gift of edX for Valentine's Day in biostatistics and epidemiology because the course is closed. And so we haven't fully figured it out, but there'll probably be different cycles. Again, it just changes also when we talked about courses, it's time to start learning. Some of the best online public health programs have 3 starts, a September start, a January start, and a June start. And they have 3 cohorts moving at different times. Perhaps this platform will lend itself to that as well.
We'll have one more question.
When you come back to the capitalization cost question, it would appear that certain institutions in America, like Harvard, MIT, Stanford, others, will have the money to do this. And I agree that there are costs, and they may be, if they're not massive, they're large.
Yeah.
But Berkeley, I think today announced they were endowing 123 new chairs or whatever at $2.5 million apiece. So the money will be there, but how do you see that shaking out in the hierarchy of institutions across the country?
Right. Well, I really enjoy your question because earlier we talked about the democratization of education, but there clearly is an arms race and there is a differential in terms of power, in terms of resources that different universities bring to the MOOC table. I do have the hope that as the platforms get more established, that they are open and that there is less cost to entry for it. I think some would argue, and Dr. Pack and I have talked a little bit about this, that perhaps sets up some very hierarchical situation where America, the world's students, learn from, quote unquote, the elite universities for certain subject matter. I don't really believe it's going to go that way because there is sort of an interesting assumption that's going on here that the best teaching takes place at the elite research universities. We no doubt have many great teachers, but so does ETSU. So do some of the world's, particularly in Tennessee, some of the great community colleges in the state. There are phenomenal teachers at those places. What I hope, and again, maybe I'm being Pollyanna in this, is that once the platform truly is open source, that we start elevating the status of great teachers across universities. Where I get excited, and it hasn't happened on any of the platforms yet, is when perhaps Berkeley School of Public Health and University of Texas School of Public Health and the Harvard School of Public Health to say, we're going to team teach X course. And we're putting our best folks together to create that ultimate course. Or as we've talked about, collaborations between ETSU and Harvard. That's when it gets really quite exciting. But what the question is framed quite appropriately. This has been an engagement with the great spirit of democratization, but carried out by the most elite institutions here in the U.S. as well as elsewhere.
Well, Ian, thank you very much. Another round of applause for Dr. Lapp. As always, Ian, we have some parting gifts for you, but you did ask early on for an acronym. So, E-REACH, sounds good, right? E-REACH, expanding the reach of education to advance the community's health. There you go.
I think that might be the greatest gift of all.
Right. Well, I know you have some of these before, but you can never have too many.
That's right.
And especially, and then of course the title of honorary professor in the College of Public Health. As always, thank you for everything you do.
Thank you. Your pleasure.
We don't have the schedule for the next Leading Voices confirmed yet. We've got a couple of really exciting ones coming up. Watch your email for small coursework there.
Great. Thank you again.